Harlan Marsh was carrying 2 buckets up the ridge when the Prescott woman's door opened and she asked if he'd like to sit. He set the buckets down on the step, straightened his back, and said he had work waiting at the livery. She nodded once and went back inside. He picked up the empties and walked down the way he'd come. It was the first time she'd spoken to him in 3 months, and he thought about it all the way back to town. The ridge was a quarter-mile from the well, steep enough that most folks who lived up there kept a barrel and filled it once a week with a wagon. Iris Prescott had no wagon, and no husband to drive one. She'd been widowed the winter before, lost the man and the homestead both to debt, and now she lived in a miner's shack somebody's cousin had abandoned when the claims played out. She took in mending and laundry, which meant she needed water daily. Harlan had seen her coming down the path one morning in May with a bucket in each hand, walking careful on account of the mud, and he'd thought about the way a person gets used to being tired. He'd taken the buckets from her without asking and carried them up. She'd looked at him like he'd spoken a language she was still translating. He'd set them inside the door and left. The next day, he'd filled them at the well and brought them up before she could make the walk. She'd been hanging a sheet. She'd stopped, watched him set the buckets down, and gone back to her work. He'd done it every day since. Harlan was 41, a widower himself, and he worked for Amos Dunbar at the livery. He was good with horses that had been ruined by impatience, and he kept the books because Amos hated numbers. He lived in a room behind the stable that was clean and spare and smelled of leather oil. He had no people. His wife had died of fever 8 years back, and they'd had no children. He didn't talk about it, and nobody asked. He was the kind of man you could forget was in the room until something needed lifting, or a horse needed settling, and then you remembered he'd been there the whole time. Iris Prescott was 34 and plain in a way that made people look past her even when she was standing in front of them. She'd married late to a man who drank, and when he died, he'd left her with nothing but the clothes she'd mended and a reputation for being proud. The town had offered help the way people do when they expect you to refuse it, and she had. She worked every hour of light and some of the dark, and she didn't ask for anything she couldn't pay back in kind. Harlan had heard all of it from the men at the livery, the way they told stories about folks who lived on the margins. They didn't say it meanly. They just said it the way you'd say the creek was running low. By the time summer came on, he'd worked out a rhythm. He'd fill the buckets before dawn, carry them up while the air was still cool, and be back at the livery before Amos noticed he'd gone. Iris was usually awake, sometimes outside bringing in wood or shaking out a rug, sometimes just standing in the doorway with her arms crossed, watching the valley wake up. She never thanked him, and he never expected it. Once she left a bowl of stewed apples on the step. He ate them on the walk back and returned the bowl the next morning. That was the only exchange they'd made. The town took note the way towns do. Harlan heard it from Bess Coyle at the Mercantile when he bought soap. She said it was a kindness, carrying water for a woman in need, and she said it in a way that meant she was deciding whether to approve. He said it wasn't far out of his way, which was a lie, and she'd nodded and let it go. By August, the story had smoothed itself into something people mentioned without thinking. Harlan Marsh carried water up to the Prescott widow. Nobody thought it was courting. She was too poor and he was too quiet, and besides, he never went inside. In September, a drummer came through selling kitchenware, and he took a room at the boarding house where Iris sometimes helped with the washing. He was a loud man, the kind who thought talking was the same as being interesting, and he decided Iris ought to be flattered by his attention. He caught her alone by the pump one evening and stood too close, talking about how a woman shouldn't live up on a ridge by herself, how he could see she knew her way around a house and maybe she'd like to see St. Louis. Harlan was coming up the street with the evening grain delivery, and he saw the way Iris had her shoulders set, the way she wasn't stepping back, but wasn't looking at the man either. Harlan stopped the wagon, climbed down, and walked over. He didn't say anything. He just stood there beside Iris, close enough that the drummer had to look up at him. The man laughed and said something about not meaning any harm, and Harlan waited. The drummer looked at Iris, looked at Harlan, and decided he'd remembered something he needed to do. He left. Iris watched him go, then looked at Harlan. She said thank you. He nodded and went back to the wagon. The next morning, when he brought the water, she'd left a jar of preserves on the step. By October, he'd been carrying her water for 5 months, and the town had stopped talking about it, which meant they'd accepted it as a fact. Harlan didn't know what he was doing or why he kept doing it, except that it felt like the only thing he did all day that wasn't for wages, or because someone had asked. He thought about her more than he meant to. He thought about the way she moved when she worked, efficient and exact, and the way she looked at the valley in the mornings, like she was memorizing it. He thought about how she never wasted a word and how that felt like a gift after a lifetime of people talking just to hear themselves. He didn't know if she thought about him at all. The first snow came in early November, and the path up the ridge turned to ice in the shade. Harlan bought a pair of cleats at the mercantile and kept carrying. Iris started leaving the door open a crack so he could set the buckets just inside without her having to come out into the cold. He never looked past the threshold. It felt like a rule neither of them had spoken, but both of them knew. One morning in late November, he came up the ridge and found her standing outside without a coat, her arms wrapped around herself, staring at the roof. There was a hole where the wind had torn the shingles loose, and snow was blowing in. He set the buckets down and looked at it. She said she'd tried to patch it with tar paper, but the wind had taken that too. He asked if she had a ladder. She said no. He went back down to the livery, borrowed Amos's ladder and a hammer and a pouch of nails and some spare shingles from the pile behind the stable, and carried it all back up. It took him 2 hours to patch the roof. She didn't come outside while he worked, but when he climbed down, she was standing there with a cup of coffee. He drank it. She took the cup back. He returned the ladder and tools and didn't say anything to Amos about where he'd been. Winter settled in hard. The water in the buckets froze on the walk up if he didn't cover them, so he started carrying them with a cloth tucked over the top. Iris left the door open wider now, and sometimes he could see the stove glowing inside, the small, neat space of her life. He still didn't go in. He didn't know why, except that it felt like crossing a line he hadn't been invited to cross, and he'd rather carry water forever than presume. In January, a letter came for Iris from a sister in Ohio, saying there was work in a dry goods store and a room above it if she wanted to come. Harlan heard about it from the postmaster's wife, who mentioned it to Amos, who mentioned it to Harlan the way he mentioned weather. Harlan didn't say anything. That night he lay awake in his room and thought about the ridge path in the mornings, the buckets in his hands, the open door and the silence that had come to feel like conversation. He thought about Ohio and how far it was and how he had no claim to ask her to stay. The next morning he brought the water up and she was standing outside, the letter in her hand. She looked at him for a long time, and he looked back. She said her sister wanted her to come to Ohio. He nodded. She said it was good work and a decent room. He nodded again. She said she hadn't decided. He set the buckets down. She said, "Why do you do this?" He said, "Because you need water." She said, "That's not what I'm asking." He looked at the valley, the snow on the hills, the smoke rising from the town. He said, "Because when I'm up here, I'm not down there." She waited. He said, "Because you never made me feel like I was interrupting." She said, "You never came inside." He said, "You never asked." She looked at him the way she'd looked at him that first morning, like she was translating. She said, "I'm asking now." He followed her in. The room was small and warm, the stove ticking, a quilt on the narrow bed, a table with 2 chairs, a shelf of books, a basket of mending. She poured 2 cups of coffee from the pot on the stove and handed him one. They sat at the table. She said she didn't know what Ohio was supposed to fix. He said he didn't either. She said she'd gotten used to the water coming up the hill. He said he'd gotten used to carrying it. She said if she stayed, she didn't want to keep living on the ridge alone. He said he had a room at the livery, but he could find something better. She said, or you could just stay here. He looked at her. She said, I'm not asking for a promise, I'm asking if you're willing. He said, I'm willing. She nodded. He finished his coffee. She said, come back tonight and bring whatever you need. He said, I will. He told Amos that afternoon that he'd be keeping different hours. Amos looked at him, looked out toward the ridge, and said it was about time. Harlan moved his things up that evening, which didn't take long because he didn't have much. Iris made supper, and they ate it without talking much, and afterward they sat by the stove and listened to the wind. It wasn't complicated, and it wasn't a story anyone would tell. It was just 2 people who'd gotten tired of being alone, deciding they didn't have to be. They married in the spring, a brief ceremony at the church, with Amos and Bess Coyle as witnesses. Iris kept taking in mending, and Harlan kept working at the livery, and they lived on the ridge for 3 more years before they saved enough to buy a small house in town. By then, the story had smoothed itself into legend. The way Harlan had carried her water for a year before she let him in, and people liked to tell it as proof that patience was a virtue. Harlan and Iris never corrected them. They knew it hadn't been patience. It had been 2 people learning to trust that the other one would still be there in the morning. 20 years later, on a winter night, much like the one when he'd first come inside, Iris asked him if he'd really carried the water just because she needed it. They were sitting by the fire in the house they'd bought, the same quilt from the ridge folded over the back of the chair. He thought about it. He said no. She waited. He said, I carried it because it gave me a reason to see you. And I didn't know how else to ask. She smiled. The private smile he'd seen that first morning and had spent 20 years earning the right to see again. She said, I knew that. He said, when? She said, the second week. He said, why didn't you ask me in sooner? She said, because I wanted to see how long you'd keep coming. He laughed, which he didn't do often, and she laughed too. Outside, the snow was falling, and the buckets he'd carried up the ridge were long since rusted and gone. But the well they dug together in the yard still ran cold and clear, and every morning he still filled it first.